For those who don't know, crows are actually smarter than we think. These creatures can count, use different tools, and solve problems that other animals find difficult to do. Aside from that, they also have excellent memory and can make plans for the future. They also understand how an event can lead to a certain result. And what's even more amazing is that they can also predict what might happen before it actually does. And those are just some of the many unique traits of crows. In this video, we will study even more closely the unique features and abilities of crows, and we will also answer how they are able to do these things. But before we start, don't forget to like this video. It means a lot to us content creators. Thank you very much, and now let's get started. In recent years, study after study has revealed surprising truths about their intelligence. The more scientists study them, the more it becomes clear that many people underestimate one of the smartest creatures in the world. In fact, some people have long noticed that crows have unusual intelligence. And this isn't just about the common crows that we know. This includes the entire family of birds known as corvids: ravens, magpies, jays, rooks, jackdaws, and many others. In total, there are about 130 species that belong to this group. Even so, people have been noticing them for thousands of years. Back in the time of ancient Greece, there was a famous writer of fables named Aesop. He lived around 600 BC, and one of his most famous stories is about a crow. Its title is The Crow and the Pitcher. In the story, a thirsty crow finds a container with water, but there was only a little water inside, so its beak couldn't reach the water. He tried to move the container, but he couldn't push or tip it over. So he thought of a way. One by one, the crow threw small stones into the container. As the stones increased, the water gradually rose until he could reach it and drink. For more than 2,600 years, many have considered this story as just a simple tale. But in August 2009, some scientists decided to test if a real crow could do the same thing. And the result was, that's exactly what they did. In a study published in Current Biology, it was shown that rooks, a close relative of crows, would spontaneously drop stones into a container of water to raise the level and get the food. But the experiment didn't end there. The researchers also wanted to know just how intelligent these birds really are, so they made the tests more difficult. In one experiment, 2 containers were placed in front of a New Caledonian crow. Both had food on top. The food was at the same height in both, but there was a big difference. One container was filled with water, while the other was filled with sand. If it was just about simply throwing stones, the crow should have tried both containers, but it didn't. It went straight to the container with water. It didn't even waste time on the container with sand. It seemed like it already knew that the level of the sand wouldn't rise, even if it dropped a lot of stones into it. This is when the scientists became even more amazed. They decided to make the test even more complicated. This time, they gave the crow white pieces of material that were all the same size. But there was a problem. Some were heavy, while others were light. As they watched the bird, something strange happened. The crow picked up a piece using its beak. It seemed like it was measuring the weight first. If it picked up a heavy one, it would throw it into the water. If it was light, it would just toss it aside and pick another one. It kept doing this over and over. It seemed to understand that heavy objects would sink and raise the water level faster, while light ones wouldn't help as much. This isn't just simple instinct. The crow first needs to examine the object it's holding and weigh it in its mind, and decide if it will be useful for its goal. For scientists, this kind of behavior is very difficult to explain if there isn't a high level of understanding and problem-solving ability. But the researchers were still not satisfied. They continued to change the conditions of the experiment. They also made containers that were wider. Some were narrower, there were different water levels, there were different types of materials that could be used. With every new challenge, the same thing kept happening again and again. The New Caledonian crow quickly found the right solution. Sometimes it needed to think for a few seconds. but there were also times when it seemed to immediately understand the problem at first glance. And as these kinds of experiments increase, one thing becomes even clearer. The crow's brain may be small compared to a human's, but when it comes to thinking, problem solving, and understanding the world around it, it is one of the most remarkable creatures science has ever discovered. Even so. But the scientists still didn't stop. At that point, they decided to create an experiment that would really challenge the crow. It's as if they're giving it a very difficult exam. They placed 3 containers with water in front of it. The one in the middle was the narrowest. That's where the delicious food the crow wanted was floating. But there was a problem. The water was too low, so its beak couldn't reach it. Beside it, there were some stones. But the researchers deliberately chose the size of these so they wouldn't fit into the narrow container in the middle. Instead, they only fit into the 2 containers on either side. There was a reason why they did that. Under the table, they secretly connected the container in the middle and the container on the right using a tube. The container on the left was separate and unconnected to the others. This means that when a stone is dropped into the container on the right, the water will rise not only there, but also in the container in the middle where the food is. But if the stone is dropped into the container on the left, nothing will happen to the water in the middle. Now the problem is harder. Simply throwing a stone is not enough. The crow first needs to understand which container has an effect and which ones do not. In other words, it needs to understand the relationship between cause and effect. At first, the crow tried different methods, but after a few attempts, it seemed to realize something. It now directly drops the stones into the correct container, the one connected to the middle. And with every stone that falls, the water gradually rises until it reaches the food. It's as if the crow has passed a simple test about an important principle in physics. Of course, it didn't study in school, but the understanding it showed is impressive. Now, to help us understand this better, let's go back to the story of Archimedes. According to legend, one day, while the ancient Greek scientist and engineer Archimedes was taking a bath, he noticed something unusual. As his body sank into the water, an equal amount of water was displaced or pushed out. That's when he thought of an important principle in science. The amount of water displaced is equal to the volume of the object submerged in the water. Because of his excitement, according to the story, he even ran while shouting, "Eureka!" This word means, "I have found it." And if we base it on experiments, it seems that crows are not far behind in that kind of understanding. They might have known that principle in their own way for a long time, especially the New Caledonian crow, which is considered one of the smartest members of the crow family. And if you're still not that impressed by the water experiments, you'll be surprised by the next experiment. Here, you'll be even more amazed. The next discoveries will be surprising. For many years, scientists have been studying the great apes. So nowadays, it's not that surprising anymore when we see a monkey using a stick to reach food. But think about this. What if the monkey actually made its own tool? That's pretty surprising. And that's exactly what some crows are doing. One of the reasons why scientists hold the New Caledonian crow in such high regard is because of its ability to make and use its own tools. And sometimes even the experts are left scratching their heads at how clever they are. And that's exactly what happened. In 2002, there were behavioral scientists from the University of Oxford who observed a New Caledonian crow they named Betty. What happened next became one of the most famous videos about animal intelligence. In the experiment, there was a small food container placed inside a long tube. Betty can see the food, but she can't reach it because the tube is too long. She was given a short piece of wire. At first, she repeatedly tried to reach the food with it, but she failed. Then it seemed like an idea came into her mind. Using her beak, she bent the wire until it became hook-shaped. Once it was formed, she was able to easily pull out the food container. And what's even more surprising is that this wasn't an accident. In 9 out of 10 subsequent trials, she repeated the same method. Because of this, Betty was recognized as one of the most remarkable birds ever studied by scientists. But for the researchers, that was just the beginning. They made the experiment even more difficult. This time, the crow had to use a short stick first to get the longer stick, and only then could it use the long stick to get the food. It's like there were two problems that needed to be solved before getting the reward. But it wasn't a problem for Betty. She quickly understood the correct sequence of steps and got the food. As time went on, the experiments became even more complicated. But New Caledonian crows repeatedly showed their impressive thinking abilities. And there was one study that really blew the minds of the scientists. Alice Auersperg from the University of Vienna and Alex Kachelnik from the University of Oxford conducted a series of experiments to find out if crows could make tools from separate pieces. 8 New Caledonian crows participated in the test. At first, they were given a long stick that they could use to reach food inside a container. They accomplished the task easily. All 8 crows successfully got the food. After this, the scientists changed the situation. They removed the long sticks. Only short pieces were left, which were useless if used separately. But there was one important difference.
Ngunit may isang mahalagang detalye.
These could be combined to form a longer stick. Some pieces were narrower and some pieces were wider. When the narrow piece is inserted into the wide one, a long tool is formed. Surprisingly, 4 out of 8 crows immediately figured out the solution even though no one taught them. They joined the pieces together. They made a longer stick and got the food. But the challenge didn't end there. The researchers made it even harder. In the new version of the experiment, the sticks could no longer be joined together directly. They now had to use a special connector or adapter to create the right tool. And this is where a true genius emerged in the group. After examining the objects in front of it, the crow understood what the adapters were for. It didn't just make a long stick from 3 parts. It was even able to create an even longer tool using 4 separate pieces. For many scientists, this is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that crows are not just following instinct. They plan and they analyze, and it doesn't end there. Since ancient times, scientists believed that only humans were capable of making tools. Then they discovered that chimpanzees could also do this. Eventually, they thought that only humans and chimpanzees had the ability to create more complex tools from separate parts. But now crows are also on that list. Just think about that. A bird can combine different pieces to make a working tool to achieve its goal. It's like a monkey that made a small chair on its own using a hammer and nails, even though no one taught it how. Despite this, the more scientists study them, the more surprising facts come out. But before we discover those, we first need to answer why science has almost ignored one of the smartest animal species on our planet. For many decades, people have noticed that crows have unusual behavior. They learn faster. They are better at solving problems. And they often do things that other birds don't usually do. But despite all those observations, many scientists still refuse to call them intelligent for a long time. There was a reason for that. For a long time, the study of thinking and intelligence was focused almost entirely on humans. Then it shifted to primates because some say they are our closest relatives in the animal kingdom, and eventually to other mammals. There is one thing that we all have in common, and that is the neocortex. The neocortex is a part of the brain that has long been considered the center of higher thinking, learning, decision-making, and problem-solving. In other words, this is the part of the brain that we have long associated with the intelligence. But there's a problem. Birds don't have a neocortex. It's not because they're underdeveloped. It's also not because they're more primitive. They simply don't have this part of the brain. Because of this, scientists in the past strongly believed that if there's no neocortex, there's no real thinking. If there's no neocortex, then all of an animal's actions are purely instinct. And because of that belief, they almost closed the discussion about the intelligence of birds before it was fully investigated. For many, everything crows do is just simple instinct. But as their behavior continues to be studied, that explanation becomes harder to believe. There are more and more cases of surprising problem solving. There are more and more observations of tool use. And there's increasing evidence showing that something deeper is happening inside their small brains. Then came laboratory experiments that could no longer be ignored. And the results showed that some members of the crow family are not only able to keep up with many mammals when it comes to intelligence, they even surpass most of them. Think about it. Can you imagine a rat making complex tools like a crow does? How about a dog? Even many dogs can't do some of the problem-solving tasks that crows are able to solve. Because of this, scientists were forced to change their perspective. There are 3 facts they can no longer deny. First, birds don't have a neocortex. Second, in mammals, the neocortex is important for intelligence. And third, birds have intelligence, especially the crow family. Therefore, there is only one logical conclusion. The design of the bird's brain is different from that of mammals. They don't need a neocortex to be intelligent. They have their own way. And this is where one of the biggest changes in the study of animal intelligence began. When scientists had more modern technology like brain imaging and tomography, they were able to observe the activity in the brains of birds without having to open their skulls. And that's where they discovered a surprising secret. The brains of crows are like tiny supercomputers. First of all, their neurons are smaller. Because of this, they can fit more neurons in the same space. Second, the arrangement of neurons in their brains is very dense. More nerve cells are packed into a smaller area, and that's not all. Scientists from Charles University, along with researchers from the University of Vienna and Vanderbilt University, discovered that the density of neurons in crows and parrots is almost twice as high as in monkeys. And it's even up to 4 times higher compared to rats. There's another important detail. Aside from being small and densely packed, their neurons also have more connections with each other. This means information is exchanged faster inside the brain. And when all these characteristics are combined, they form a very effective information processing system. This is one of the reasons why crows are able to do things that we once thought were only possible for primates. And sometimes it's a bit scary to think about how intelligent they are. For example, what if we told you that there are crows that can use vending machines? Yes, you heard that right. There are crows that have learned to use machines to get rewards. And this isn't just a simple trick. This is an experiment conducted to measure how quickly these birds can learn something they've never seen in nature. Sarah Gelbart from the University of Cambridge developed this test. Her goal was simple. She wanted to find out how quickly crows would learn when faced with a completely new situation. And the result was yet another proof that crows might be smarter than we think. Here's what they did. They created a task that had almost nothing to do with a bird's normal life. The material they chose? Paper. In nature, there's no reason for a crow to use paper to find food. So if they can solve this problem, it means they are truly thinking and not just relying on instinct or past experience. For the experiment, the researchers made a simple vending machine for the birds. This is how it works. When a piece of paper is inserted into a small slot, a piece of meat comes out as a reward. At first, the crows were shown how to use it. Soon enough, they quickly understood the system. They learned that the paper is like payment, and the meat is the reward in exchange. But of course, the scientists were still not satisfied. They made the test harder again. This time, they gave the crows large pieces of paper that wouldn't fit in the slot of the vending machine. To get the food, they first had to figure out how to make it fit. And what happened was surprising. According to Sarah Gelbart, almost half of those tested succeeded. They were the ones who thought of tearing the paper into smaller pieces on their own. No one taught them. No one showed them an example. They came up with the solution themselves. But that wasn't even the coolest part. The researchers wanted to know if the crows could remember the correct size of the paper, even without any guidance. So each of the 8 crows was given its own vending machine. Each machine only accepted paper of a particular size. If the size was wrong, there was no reward. If it was correct, they got meat. And what's even more surprising, no sample or template was shown to the birds. They had to remember the exact size of paper needed for their own machine from memory. Then they had to make it themselves, and they succeeded. They remembered the correct size and were able to make paper that was exactly what they needed to get their reward. In fact, it was as if they had learned to use a simple form of money. And because of this, scientists came up with a new question. They can understand the concept of a token that can be exchanged for food, but can they also count? The question may sound like a joke, but the researchers seriously tried this. At the University of Tübingen, Helen Dietz and Andreas Nieder decided to find out if crows can really count. To be sure of the results, they placed special neural sensors on 2 crows to monitor their brain activity while conducting the experiment. Then they taught the birds a simple game on a screen. On the first screen, 1 to 5 black dots would appear inside a gray circle. After a while, it would disappear. Then a new image would appear. If the number of dots matches the first image, the crow should peck at the screen. If the answer is correct, there is a reward like this. Now, there is an important detail here. They are not shown the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Only dots are shown. And in each trial, the size and position of the dots also vary so that they cannot recognize the image just by its shape. In other words, they really have to count. And the result was surprising. In about 75% of the cases, the crows answered correctly. This is far from simple guessing, which would only have a 50% chance. They made mistakes more often when there were 4 or 5 dots. The more they had to count, the harder it was for them. And for scientists, this is an important sign that they are really counting and not just guessing. While all of this was happening, another truly amazing thing was discovered. The sensors monitored the activity of about 500 neurons in the birds' brains. And it turned out that almost 100 of these neurons, their activity changes depending on the number of dots the crow sees. There are neurons that seem to be specialized for the number 1. Others are more active when counting 2 or more. It's like their brains have their own counting system. Even more surprising, the way these neurons work is similar to the processes seen in the brains of primates. And let's remember, the brains of birds and monkeys are very different in design. But despite this, both have developed a way to understand numbers. And if you think that's the most amazing part, just wait. Because the next experiment hits right at an ability that scientists have long thought was unique to humans. This is called recursion. If you're a software engineer or a linguist, you're probably familiar with this term. But to make it easier to understand, let's think of a simple sentence. For example, Catherine told John that Susan ate the ice cream that she bought. In this sentence, there's an idea contained within another idea, and within that there's yet another one. This is a small connection. This is a simple example of recursion. It's the ability to understand overlapping information and keep track of who is doing what. This is very important in human languages. Without it, it would be very difficult to make long sentences and complex ideas. But even people have limitations here. When a sentence is too long and has too many overlapping details, we also get confused. That's why sometimes we need to reread difficult passages. Difficult passages can be hard to understand. For a long time, scientists believed that only humans have the ability to understand recursion. They believed that other animals lack the memory and processing power to do this. But everything changed in 2020 when a series of experiments led American biologists to discover that humans are not the only ones capable of understanding a simple form of recursion. They tested this on monkeys. Of course, they weren't given long sentences about Catherine, John, and Susan. Instead, they used simpler symbols, different types of brackets. The test subjects had to arrange the brackets in the correct order to receive a reward like this. This is like the simplest version of recursion that can be done in an experiment. Adults solved it easily. But children around 3 to 4 years old made mistakes in almost half of the trials. And this is where the results became more interesting. The adult monkeys performed almost the same as those children. Although it took them longer to learn the rules of the game, they showed that they could also understand the basic concept of recursion. And at this point, scientists began to ask, if monkeys can do this, is it also possible for crows to do it?